Thousands of women played an active role in the Nazi extermination system. They were not merely victims or bystanders, they were perpetrators. When the Third Reich collapsed, the fate of these female SS guards fell into the hands of the Allied forces. Some were discovered right in the concentration camps where they had enforced terror. Others escaped, destroyed their uniforms, disguised themselves as prisoners, or adopted new identities. Trials were held, but not for everyone. While some women were publicly executed for crimes against humanity, many others were released, protected, or even recruited as spies by Western intelligence agencies. Out of this emerged the stereotype popularized by films and fiction. The young, attractive blonde guard with the cold stare and flawless uniform. A figure that fused the ordinariness of evil with the distorted image of female power under the Nazi regime. What became of the SS women after the fall of Nazi Germany? And why did most of them escape prosecution? The rise and training of the SS female guards in Nazi Germany. Terror was not carried out solely by soldiers or high-ranking officials. Thousands of ordinary women became essential components of the machinery of repression. They served as Aufseherinnen, female overseers in the concentration camps. Their story began in 1938, when the SS established Lichtenberg, the first women's camp, to control the growing number of female prisoners. Johanna Langfeld, a widow, was appointed chief supervisor. She was not a hardcore Nazi, but she had something the regime valued: even more experience and strict discipline. The system grew quickly. In 1939, Ravensbrück CAC was opened to house thousands of female inmates. According to an official manual signed by Theodor Eicke, women guards had nearly the same authority as their male counterparts. They could order, punish, and humiliate prisoners, though they were not allowed to carry firearms. Initially, the SS recruited older women with proven disciplinary backgrounds, typically requiring a recommendation from the Nazi Party or local authorities. But as the camps expanded dramatically, priorities shifted. They now sought young, impressionable recruits who could be easily molded. That was how Dorothea Binz, almost still a teenager, joined. Despite having no prior experience, she became an ideal candidate: obedient, hardened, and merciless. Binz would eventually design the training program used for all future female guards. Between 1942 and 1944, staffing needs skyrocketed. Recruitment campaigns offered free housing, daily meals, uniforms, and wages above average. Many women, like Elizabeth Vulcan, a former hairdresser, saw this as a fast path to social mobility. Training at Ravensbrück CAC was harsh and methodical. Week 1, intense racial indoctrination, teaching recruits that prisoners were not real people, but biological dangers. Week 2, instruction in control and punishment. Week 3, selection procedures for forced labor or death. One of the first to gain attention was Hermann Bronsteiner, later infamous as the Marex Mare, who was praised for her emotional detachment and unhesitating brutality. Cruelty was rewarded. Irma Gries, only 18, later testified that guards lived comfortably private rooms, 3 meals a day, and care packages so long as they submitted completely to SS ideology. The most violent rose quickly. Hildegard Lurchen, later called the Bloody Woman of Majdanek, was promoted within 6 months. Transfers between camps Ravensbrück CAC, Auschwitz, Majdanek provided opportunities for advancement. Women were placed where their skills best fit. Gertrude Feist, with office training, managed prisoner records, while Elizabeth Lupke, physically stronger, oversaw forced labor crews in the quarries. Not all started out cruel. Margot Drexler, for instance, was initially deemed too soft. 6 months later, she was praised as exemplarily strict. Training even included courses on pregnancy and handling infants because in the camps, newborns were routinely taken from their mothers and either racially evaluated or killed. Camp rotation ensured that all guards experienced tasks such as barracks oversight, kitchen supervision, forced marches, and participation in executions. Herta Bothe, for example, served in Ravensbrück CAC, then Stutthof, then Neuengamme subcamps, and ended her service at Bergen-Belsen. This flexibility was seen as a great asset. Brutal internal competition was fostered. Hellenmusser organized punishment units that competed weekly. The most efficient Recyvedbeter rations. This system produced macabre innovations. Idischer Kombinetextrem cold and immersion in ice water. Lisbezabeth Kruzak applied sleep deprivation in painful positions. Wardens with medical training were particularly dangerous. Erika oversaw selections of prisoners based on physical traits such as eye color or hair texture. Geraheim administered lethal injections to unproductive prisoners at Auschwitz. Social and linguistic distancing was strict. Euler stipulated that no prisoner look her in the eye. Ilse Foster punished mistakes in speaking German. This extreme control systematically dehumanized the victims. As the Allies advanced in 1945, many guards tried to disappear, hunted Ammengrooms. The relentless persecution of SS women. The capture of the Alfier Rheinen was no accident. The Allies, assisted by personnel lists, administrative documents, and survivor testimonies, located and arrested hundreds of them in camps such as Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. Many attempted to hide by disguising themselves as prisoners, but the identifications were systematic and documented. Ravensbrück, located 90 kilometers north of Berlin, served as the main training center for these guards. Of the approximately 3,500 women who served as Alfsinnen, more than 900 received training at this women's camp. By the time the Red Army arrived on April 30, 1945, many had fled, but others were captured. The Soviets conducted demedited interrogations and recovered abandoned records containing detailed information on each woman. At Auschwitz evacuated in January 1945. The guards participated in the infamous death marches or were redeployed to Western camps. A list found in the administrative offices revealed the names of 170 women assigned to different sectors of the complex. With this information, Soviet authorities began searches in Silesia, where several Trito remain undetected by changing clothes with sick prisoners or pretending to be common inmates. However, it was at Bergen-Belsen that the best documented captures occurred, thanks to the meticulous work of the British. On April 15, 1945, General James H. Hill's troops liberated the camp, finding more than 10,000 unburied bodies and an SS team still on duty. Among the surrendered personnel were 28 female guards who had no time to flee. The photograph taken by George Roger, showing them lined up alongside male officers, became one of the most iconic images of this historic moment. Among them, Irma Grace, barely 22 years old, was immediately recognized by survivors, who pointed to her as responsible for systematic torture. However, many employed improvised methods to evade justice. They dressed as prisoners, burned their papers, or claimed to be camp nurses or cooks. At Stutthof, where some 47 SS women paraded, a bonfire of papers and clothing was found in the administrative block. Clear evidence of a disparate attempt to erase incriminating evidence. Others escaped to Austria and Bavaria using false papers or fabricated identities. Despite these attempts, the Allies produced extensive documentation of these arrests. The British archives preserved the Bergen-Belsen arrest lists, while the Soviets compiled reports on the captures at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Mugshots show these women with numbered badges around their necks, some holding makeshift signs with their name and function. Far from appearing remorseful, many were defiant. As British Corporal Reginald Norris noted, they stood in line as feet were a changing of the guard. They weren't crying. One even asked for a cigarette. When we started taking pictures, some of them looked straight into the camera. They looked proud. Thus, the capture of the SS women wasn't simply an act of retaliation, but a documented, structured, and evidence-based operation. Although many managed to escape, hundreds were arrested thanks to lists, survivor testimonies, and forensic traces. Their faces, now recorded in historical archives, would go on to face various fates, from swift justice to, in many cases, disturbing impunity. Arrested after the collapse. The treatment of SS guards in Allied camps. Arrested after the collapse. The treatment of SS guards in Allied camps. After the fall of the Third Reich, thousands of members of the Nazi apparatus were captured on a continent plunged into chaos. Among them, the Offizieren, the female guards of the concentration camps, faced an uncertain fate. Not all were immediately tried or faced death by hanging. Many spent weeks, months, and even years as prisoners in Allied custody, in a silent wait that oscillated between fear, degradation, and humiliation. Classified as potential war criminals. The guards were interned in Allied centers such as Bergen, Belsen, and Lundberg. They received minimal rations, were photographed, and were isolated, subjected to interrogations. The total loss of control they once exercised became a psychological torture that for many marked the beginning of their downfall. In British camps, such as Civil Internment Camp No. 5 in Lundberg, conditions were harsh but regulated. Wardens shared barracks surrounded by barbed wire, received minimal rations, were subjected to routine cleaning, and worked on basic housekeeping duties. Interrogations were conducted daily, alternating direct questions about their role in the camps with evaluations of their behavior in custody. Psychological isolation was a constant. No outside contact, confiscation of letters, and constant surveillance. For women only weeks earlier had held absolute power over the life and death of others. The loss of control was devastating on the other side of Europe. The fate of female guards captured by the Red Army was radically different. The Soviets, less interested in formal judicial proceedings, viewed all SS personnel as directly complicit in the genocide. Many guards were transferred to forced labor camps in Belarus and Siberia. Physical and sexual violence was a bitter reality. Contemporary records document cases of systematic sexual abuse against prisoners, including female members. It didn't matter whether they were young or old. Their membership in the extermination machinery marked them as legitimate targets of the hatred unleashed after years of brutal occupation. Their treatment, more than the application of justice, was in many cases a ruthless revenge. In the American occupation zones, the approacto the guards was more administrative. They were held in facilities such as the Moosburg internment camp, where they were held in relatively stable but strictly controlled conditions. The priority was obtaining information, names, internal structures of the camps, and the involvement of senior officers. The American interrogators, Samedimes veterans of combat against Nazism, approached the guards with a mixture of contempt and method. Cooperation, real or feigned, could mean better internment conditions, resistance, additional months of detention in conditions of sensory deprivation and isolation. Some of the most infamous guards, such as Irma Grazer and Elizabeth Vulkenrath, spent weeks as common detainees before being formally charged. There was no preferential treatment or special measures during their initial internment. They shared makeshift cells with other women of lower rank, exposito the collective resentment of a world only just beginning to grasp the magnitude of their crimes. Grace Botti, in particular, attracted the morbid attention of some British soldiers, but also their contempt. Accounts from guards record how she was subjected to insults, verbal humiliation, and continued hostility throughout her captivity. The wait became a mental torture. Many guards didn't know whether they would be released, tried, or summarily executed. The Allied legal system was slow to organize formal proceedings, prolonging the uncertainty. Some women tried to minimize their guilt during interrogations, claiming their work had been administrative or that they had simply followed orders. Others, confronted by surviving witnesses, realized that silence would no longer be an effective defense. In some makeshift camps under British control, medical reports mention cases of female guards who developed psychosomatic disorders, severe insomnia, histriform paralysis, and episodes of selective mutism. However, there were no systematic medical or psychological support programs for them. The priority was strict custody, not rehabilitation among the female guards. Behavioral differences quickly began to emerge. Some maintained a defiant attitude, clinging to the lost ideology of the Third Reich. Others begged for mercy. claiming to have been mere cogs in a machine they never fully understood. There were documented cases of suicide in custody, although to a lesser extent than among higher-ranking SS officers. The lack of hope for salvation and the weight of the testimony that was beginning to emerge against them broke Keith's psychological resilience of many. The transition from executioner to prisoner was neither immediate nor uniform. For some, it was a slow process of degradation and reverse dehumanization. The uniform that had once inspired fear was now a symbol of shame. The same body that had once marched to the martial beat of Nazi victory now cowered in cold corners under the watchful eye of former enemies. The internment phase represented for the captured SS women a bitter limbo between their past of absolute power and inevitable judgment or oblivion. Bureaucratic. There, without protection of the regime they had served, they faced for the first time the reality of their actions, or in many cases, the inevitable consequence of their criminal indifference. In the Allied prisoner of war camps, the officerin and ceased to be symbols of terror and became mere numbers on lists of detainees. But the weight of their crimes, although temporarily silenced by confinement, lay inexorably before them in the court files being prepared in interrogation rooms lit by bare bulbs. The fall had begun, and there would be no turning back. The selection process to determine who would be brought to trial and who would not was chaotic and uneven. While some guards faced formal charges for war crimes, others were classified as low-priority personnel or minor collaborators, which allowed for their early release. The lack of detailed individual evidence and political pressure to accelerate the destabilization of West Germany led to numerous cases being closed without formal investigation. Final judgment. When the executioners faced history following the collapse of the Third Reich, the Allies faced the monumental challenge of prosecuting those responsible for the Nazi genocide. The trials of the female guards formed a unique chapter in this endeavor, revealing gruesome details about their active participation in the machinery of death. Despite this, only a fraction of the total was brought to trial, demonstrating that post-war justice had significant limitations. Belsen trial held by a British military tribunal in Lundberg between September and November 1945. This trial included 45 defendants, 16 of them women who had served at both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. They faced serious charges: complicity and mass murder, physical and psychological torture, selection for the gas chambers, and criminal negligence in supervising the camp. The tribunal applied Section 4 of the Allied Control Council Act, which allowed for the prosecution of crimes against humanity. Among the accused were Lagera and Elisabeth Vulkenrath, emblematic figures of female brutality in the camps. Testimonies included beatings, selections for gas chambers, and public punishments. Both were sentenced to death, along with 3 other women at the Bergen-Belsen trials. On November 17, 1945, the court issued its verdict: 11 death sentences, 5 of them women, 19 prison terms, and 14 acquit. Grieser, Falkenat, Wannebormann, Fred Schultz, and Francisco Schreider were sentenced to death by hanging. British executioner Albert Perpoint carried out the sentences at Hamlin Prison a month later. Reporting in his official report how Giari, despite her youth, maintained a cool and defiant demeanor until the very end. At the same time, the Auschwitz trial organized by the Supreme National Court of Poland in Krakow at the end of 1947 dealt exclusively with the crimes committed at the largest extermination camp of the Nazi regime. Among the 40 defendants were 4 SS women. Maria Mandel, the chief guard at women's camp, was accused of ordering executions, participating in selections, and running the infamous block, earning her the nickname the Female Beast of Auschwitz. Tara Sprol, Louise Dans, and Alice Olofsky faced charges of brutality against pregnant women, beatings with metal rods, and involvement in the separation of children for gassing. Mandel and Braille were sentenced to death and executed in January 1948, while Dans received a life sentence, and Olofsky, 15 years in prison. Ravensbrück. Trials held in 5 series between 1946 and 1948 by British military tribunals in Hamburg were the longest running trials involving a women's camp. 38 SS women and 6 doctors were tried. Dorothea Binns, the training chief at Ravensbrück and known for beating prisoners to death with her bamboo cane, faced testimony implicating her in collective executions and punishments. Emma Zimmer was accused of overseeing the gassing of prisoners selected for being unfit for work. Ruth Nadek, known as the Scourge of the Poles, led firing squads. The first trial resulted in 11 death sentences, including these 3 women whose executions took place in May 1947 during the interrogations. A common defensive pattern emerged among the accused. Ilma Graca stated, "I don't remember shooting anyone directly, but I did shout for them to stay in formation during the selections." Mandel insisted, "I had no choice. The names were sent by Dr. Mangler. I simply opened the door of the block." Ruth N.C. argued, "If I did not follow orders, I would have ended up on the gallows myself. That was the law of the camp." However, the court that convicted Dorothea Binns stated in its judgment, "The court finds it proven beyond reasonable doubt that the accused beat, tortured, and murdered with full awareness of her actions." Her sadism was corroborated by 23 witnesses. Official figures compiled by the Unwar Crimes Commission 1949 confirmed that a total of 58 women were tried, 18 sentenced to death, and 30 to various prison terms. It is crucial to understand that hundreds of other SS women were never prosecuted. Some managed to evade justice, others were arrested, but released after short sentences, and a smaller number died before being tried. These trials not only made female brutality visible, but also laid the legal groundwork for considering any individual, regardless of gender, as a potential perpetrator of crimes against humanity. The names of Grosser, Binns, Mandel, and Vulkenrath became synonymous with brutality, and their trials set a precedent that continues to resonate in international courts in the 21st century. Hanged without forgiveness, thus who paid with their lives. At the end of the war, as the world processed the magnitude of the Nazi horror, Allied military tribunals executed a small group of women who hadn't been mere observers, but active perpetrators of terror in the camps. Their executions, meticulous litigant by witnesses and military archives, constituted an exceptional chapter in the history of international justice, demonstrating that accountability for crimes against humanity knew no gender. The most emblematic case was that of Irma, born in 1923. She joined the SS Women's Auxiliary Corps at just 18 years old. After training at Ravensbrück, she was sent to Auschwitz, where she quickly rose to become a supervisor. In 1945, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she remained until her capture by British troops on April 15. During her trial, witnesses detailed how she personally selected women for the gas chambers, whipped those who did not greet her with a leather whip, and unleashed attack dogs on defenseless prisoners. Survivors recounted acts of sexual humiliation and want and violence that she carried out with apparent pleasure. Giari was sentenced to death on November 17, 1945, at just 22 years old. The British and European press portrayed her as a sinister mix of beauty and evil. During the court hearings, she appeared haughty, denying any guilt and repeating, "I was just doing what I was told." Her youth and physical attractiveness contrasted with the cruelty of her actions, creating an image that would morbidly fascinate the public for decades. For her part, Elizabeth Vulkanthrepetent, a higher hierarchical level, born in 1919, she served as the general supervisor of women at Auschwitz and later at Bergen-Belsen. Her record included coordinating selections for gas chambers, directing collective punishments, and designing grueling work schedules that led to deaths from exhaustion. During the proceedings, several witnesses identified her as personally responsible for selecting hundreds of women to be sent to the crematoriums. One survivor stated that Vulkenrath signed documents with the same indifference someone might show when ordering a cup of coffee. Her role in administration did not lessen her guilt. Instead, it revealed how women also occupied organizational positions within the machinery of genocide. Johanna Bormann, known as the Dog Woman, was infamous for using trained dogs to torment prisoners. Born in 1893, she was among the oldest guards at Bergen-Belsen. Witnesses testified that the dogs, conditioned to attack at the slightest signal, would leap upon starving women on Bormann's command, while she watched with clear satisfaction. During her trial, she remained expressionless, neither denying the accusations nor reacting emotionally. Her age did not count as a mitigating factor due to the extreme brutality she had displayed. On December 12, 1945, the British War Office approved the execution of 11 individuals convicted in the Bergen-Belsen trials, including Gries, Volkenrath, and Bormann. The execution order specified every detail: the date, December 13th, the location, Hamelin Prison, the executioner, Albert Point, the method, hanging, and even the technical setup. The schedule dictated that each execution occur 30 minutes apart to allow forensic examination of each body. Albert Point, Britain's official executioner, carried out the sentences quickly and with precision. Irma Gries, Elizabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were hanged on December 13, 1945, in a special room within Hamelin Prison, with no public audience. Only Point, a forensic doctor, 2 British officers, and a civilian witness attended. The bodies were photographed for legal records and buried in unmarked graves in the prison cemetery. Forensic reports by Dr. James Wallace concluded that death was instantaneous in all cases due to a broken neck, with no signs of struggle, indicating that the hangings were conducted according to protocol. Beyond those executed at Hamelin, other female SS guards were condemned to death by Soviet and Polish tribunals between 1946 and 1948. Maria Mandel and Theris Brandl were executed in 1948 following the Auschwitz trials. Dorothea Binz was hanged in May 1947 after being convicted at the Ravensbrück CAC trial. All were found guilty of torture, participation in mass murder, and systematic crimes against humanity. These executions were unprecedented. For the first time in modern legal history, military courts formally acknowledged women's active involvement in war crimes and imposed the death penalty without gender-based exceptions. Irma Gries became a notorious symbol of female Nazism, and her execution, along with those of Volkenrath and Bormann, represented the minority of female guards who were punished for consciously embracing cruelty and helping construct the horrors of the concentration camp system. However, the collapse of the Third Reich in May 1945 led to a very different outcome for most of the female perpetrators. Although some were prosecuted and executed, the majority received light sentences, benefited from early release policies, or simply vanished into post-war Germany under assumed identities. Even those who were convicted often served only a small portion of their sentences. West Germany's reconstruction efforts, shaped by the emerging Cold War, facilitated leniency and reintegration. Many women rebuilt their lives under new names, while survivors publicly condemned the lack of accountability. Hamelin Prison serves as a clear example. Case File 407A shows that Herta, both sentenced to 10 years for brutality at Ravensbrück CAC and Bergen-Belsen, was freed in December 1951 after serving only 6. Witnesses had described her beating prisoners with a wooden paddle until they bled. Her defense was that she did not hit hard, only enough to keep order. Positive prison evaluations aided her early release. An April 1950 report stated, "Prisoner both has shown good behavior, cooperates with staff, and displays limited remorse." Recommended for sentence review. Such assessments were typical, enabling many former guards to petition for reinstatement and receive substantial sentence reductions. Survivors protested these outcomes. Helena Malinowska, a Polish Jewish journalist and Bergen-Belsen survivor, testified in 1963 during an attempt to reopen Bode's case. In 1955, "I saw her at a market in Hanover," she said. "She was selling flowers. Her face was the same, only her hair was different. I froze. How could someone who beat us every morning walk free?" The denazification process distinguished between ideological leaders and lower-level collaborators, allowing many Aufseherinnen to be categorized as Mitläuferinnen, passive followers. Between 1949 and 1954, dozens of female SS guards were released by decisions from Allied authorities, particularly the British and Americans. The American military governor Lucius D. Clay, in charge of the American zone, justified these measures in an official letter of 1950. Not all those convicted of war crimes participated in murders. Some simply fulfilled secondary functions. Keeping these people in prison is unnecessary for the stability of West Germany. Under this reasoning, guards such as Ilse Alice Orlovsky and Elsa Kruger were released before 1955, finding employment in hospitals, schools, or small businesses, often under new identities. Anonymity became the primary strategy for evading justice. During the 1950s, the German Ministry of the Interior recorded more than 200 name changes linked to former Nazi officials. One of them was a Petri, convicted in 1961 of murdering 6 Jewish children in Ukraine, had lived for years as Nachschiffer in Bavaria. The most enigmatic case was that of Elfriede Mohnke, a guard at Lublin-Majdanek, sentenced to 10 years in 1948. She was released in 1952 and disappeared completely. A 1983 Dispel investigation located her in Hamburg working as a seamstress under the name Alfreda Malherpent. Beginning in the 1960s, some German courts reopened cases, partly due to international pressure. However, many guards were declared unfit for trial due to their advanced age. A small number of guards expressed public regret. Gertrude. In 1988, Heiser wrote a letter to the Auschwitz Museum acknowledging her role as a guard at Ravensbrück, but her testimony was never used in legal proceedings. The vast majority remained silent as a defensive strategy. As historian Johannes Toole summarized, the female guards who survived the war did so thanks to 3 factors: their anonymity, their gender, which placed them outside the judicial spotlight, and the apathy of a Europe that quickly wanted to forget. The final figures are telling. Of approximately 3,500 SS women in the camps, only 200 were prosecuted. Of these, 18 were sentenced to death, 115 received prison sentences, more than 70 were granted early release, and at least 200 legally changed their identity. While the names Greg or Maria Mandels were etched in the annals of Nazi horror, most returned to civilian life, married, worked, and died in old age without facing further trial or showing remorse. After their release, many former SS guards managed to quietly reintegrate into German civilian life. Some found employment in hospitals, factories, or as teachers in rural schools, where their past remained hidden thanks to new identity documents or simple omissions in their records. The lack of effective public scrutiny, coupled with the need to quickly rebuild West Germany, made it easy for women responsible for atrocious crimes to resume seemingly normal lives. This silence almost never recorded in official files. It contributed to the fact that the memory of his actions became blurred in the collective memory of the post-war period. Enemy spies, the Nazis who worked for the Allies. At the end of World War II, Europe was divided between irreconcilable ideological blocs. The West, led by the United States and the United Kingdom, sought to rebuild West Germany as an anti-communist bastion. In this context, justice against Nazi criminals was subordinated to geostrategic interests, generating a phenomenon as dark as it was revealing the integration of former SS members, including female concentration camp guards as informants or undercover agents into Allied intelligence networks. The most documented case is that of Hildegard Liehut, known as the bloodthirsty woman of Majdanek. Born in Berlin in 1920, she initially worked as a nurse until being assigned an officer at Ravensbrück, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. Her reputation was forged through acts of extreme violence against female prisoners. Survivors recounted how she would whip, kick, and single women out for the gas chambers with particular cruelty. One witness recalled, when she spoke to prisoners, her face would change completely, taking on a bestial expression. After being arrested in 1947 by Polish authorities, she waystrayed during the Lublin trials. The Polish Supreme National Court sentenced her to 15 years in prison for her direct involvement in the murder of prisoners. However, in 1956, just 9 years after her sentence, Lerd was released for good behavior as part of sentencing reviews quietly pushed by Western agencies interested in her potential usefulness. Documents declassified by the German Intelligence Service Archive (BND) reveal that between 1956 and 1958, Leet was recruited by the CIA and the Gehlen organization, the precursor to the BN, to act as an informant in West Berlin. Her knowledge of Eastern Europe, network of contacts, and experience in Poland made her an ideal candidate for infiltrating communist circles. A December 1957 report by the Field Operations Division of CIA Berlin Station detailed Operator H. Lerd presents a useful profile for operations in the Polish sector. She has experience in the field. He speaks fluent German, Polish, and basic Russian. He has fully cooperated in assessment sessions. Thesia used it primarily for reconnaissance of former Polish communist fighters, surveillance in the ports of Szczecin, and gathering the names of former Soviet agents operating in East Germany. Another document from the Office of Policy Coordination of the BND in Bonn dated 1959, boarded agent B47 Leet has submitted 2 reports on suspicious movements in the Gorso sector. Will Kopolski. The information is consistent with independent sources. A bonus of 400 German marks is authorized. Despite her ties to Western services, her past as a war criminal never completely disappeared. In 1975, new evidence provided by Maidanek survivors allowed her case to be reopened. The 1981 Dusseldorf trial was one of the longest post-war trials. Leet was formally charged with complicity in the deaths of 180 people and systematic mistreatment of hundreds of prisoners. Witnesses described how she would kick the bellies of pregnant women, while saying less scum is born that way, and how she would lead lines toward the crematorium while whistling children's tunes. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, but the sentence was considered partially served due to her previous detention in Poland. She returned to civilian life in 1985 and died a free woman in 1995, never showing remorse for her crimes. Although Lerd is the best-known case, she was not the only one. The Gehlen organization, made up of former Wehrmacht and SS officers, systematic literatic individuals with territorial experience in Eastern Europe. Among its collaborators are at least 3 former SS guards who served as informants for the BND between 1955 and 1962. Although their names remain partially classified, a BN document declassified in 2011 entitled En Verbongen out dem Sektori Malaga. NS Funktioner recruitment from the sector of former Nazi Funktionärinsel, a section on women with experience in Poland and Ukraine recruited for counterintelligence operation. The report notes that these women's knowledge of customs, rural roots, and local slang, in addition to their authoritative training, makes them especially valuable for observation and intelligence gathering in hard-to-reach regions. These agreements implied a tacit pact collaboration in exchange for immunity from prosecution. This mechanism, although useful to Western interests, blocked for years the efforts of victims groups to bring more perpetrators to justice. Historian Klaus-Dieter Müller of the Potsdam Institute of Military History explains these were not accidental decisions. It was a strategy designed to build a network that could compete with the KGB. If that meant resorting to former war criminals, it was assumed to be a necessary evil. In 2011, the German Bundestag passed a motion to declassify documents related to Operation Paperclip, the Nazi informant network. It revealed that at least 72 former officers and officials of the regime actively collaborated with the Allies, including 5 women who had served in concentration camps. Records indicated that approximately 120 Nazi collaborators worked for the BN between 1949 and 1962, with at least 80 documented cases of payments to informants with Nazi pasts. The story of the female guardians did not always end in the dock or under the gallows. Some, like Hildegard Lehet, Thayence again occupied central roles, not as prisoners, but as agents in the service of new powers. The incorporation of war criminals into intelligence networks was not an isolated phenomenon. Under operations such as Paperclip in the United States and Operation Gladio in Europe, dozens of former Nazis, including concentration camp officers, were recruited to fight communist expansion. This strategy, although considered pragmatic at the time, left deep wounds in historical memory and fueled theories of cover-up and double standards in post-war justice processes. Disappeared without a trace. The Guardians, who erased their identity. In May 1945, the Allies began the Herculean task of identifying and prosecuting those responsible for the genocide committed in the concentration camps. However, while key Nazi leaders faced trials at Nuremberg, hundreds of women who served as guards managed to evade justice. They changed their names, blended into the civilian population, immigrated to other continents, or simply disappeared in the post-war chaos, starting new lives built on silence and denial. The end of the war brought with it an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. With millions of displaced persons, refugees, liberated prisoners, and defeated soldiers moving across Europe, identification structures temporarily collapsed. Hundreds of former SS guards took advantage of the situation to disappear without a trace. In camps such as Stutthof, Auschwitz, and Ravensbrück, at least 300 SS women disappeared in the days following liberation, according to reports from Allied military tribunals. Many stripped off their uniforms, burned compromising documents, and dressed as prisoners or civilians to blend in with the population. A Soviet NKVD report from May 1945 confirmed that an unknown number of female SS personnel were hidden by relatives in villages in eastern Germany. Red Army arrest records show that more than a dozen women initially captured as inmates were later identified as former guards thanks to reports from survivors. With the collapse of the Nazi bureaucratic system, obtaining false documentation was relatively easy. Many guards resorted to papers stolen from dead civilians or forms abandoned by Wehrmacht or the German Red Cross, adapting existing identities. At other times, they adopted common unregistered names, taking advantage of the destruction of municipal archives by elite bombing. A 1973 study by the German Bundesarchiv determined that at least 137 former SS guards legally changed their names between 1945 and 1950. Some files include notes such as not traceable under maiden or married name or suspected of residing in Hesse under a false name. Many female guards disappeared using false documents, changing their names, or immigrating to countries like Argentina and Brazil, where weak immigration structures facilitated their escape. The lack of records and the destruction of documents allowed hundreds to live with impunity for decades. Although fewer than men, at least a dozen female guards have been documented as escaping to the Southern Hemisphere. In her book, Reckonings, Legacies of Nazi Persecution, historian Mary Fulbrook mentions the case of Gisela K., a former guard in Lublin who boarded a ship from Genoa to Buenos Aires in 1948 using the passport of a bombing victim. Argentine immigration records discovered in 2003 by the Wiesenthal Center revealed that young, single women of German origin arrived between 1946 and 1952 with documents issued by the International Red Cross, an organization that unwittingly facilitated the escape of many Nazis by offering papers as displaced persons without nationality. These women arrived as nurses, teachers, or housewives, categories that did not trust suspicion at immigration controls. Over the years, and thanks to the efforts of survivors, researchers, and memorial centers, many unpunished cases began to be reopened in West Germany, beginning in 1958 with the creation of the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes. Stellendienstverwahrung began systematically tracing missing former guards. However, the results were limited. Elfriede Monica, a warden in Lublin and Ravensbrück, sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1948 and released early in 1952, has completely disappeared from public records. A journalistic investigation by Der Spiegel located her in 1983 in Hamburg working as a seamstress under the name Alfreda. Mayer refused to testify, and the case could not be reopened due to legal technicalities and statutes of limitations. German law presented numerous obstacles to effective prosecution. For years, penalties for complicity and murder were minimal, and the lack of individual documentary evidence led to frequent acquit. Furthermore, until 1979, many crimes were not considered imprescriptible under the German legal code. A 1985 Ministry of Justice report acknowledged that the combination of antiquated laws, lack of documentation, and limited political will prevented the full exercise of justice in many cases. This legal reality allowed even women recognized by multiple witnesses to be released for humanitarian or technical reasons. The women who served as guards in concentration camps not only participated in one of the most brutal extermination systems in history, but many managed to escape any accountability, post-war chaos, legal loopholes, a lack of political will, and German social media facilitated their disappearance. They changed their names, mingled with survivors, immigrated to countries with extradition, and lived anonymous lives, while their victims remained scarred by the horror they had experienced. The exodus of war criminals utilized clandestine networks known as rat routes, established with the help of local sympathizers, clergy, and Red Cross officials. From Genoa or Marls, many crossed into Latin America using forged passports or displaced person certificates. Although the majority of fugitives were men, recent records indicate that numerous women linked to war crimes also used these channels to escape. The Forbidden Escape, the only guardian saved by prisoners. In the dark catalogue of women who served as guards in the concentration camps of the Third Reich, Johanna Langer-Feld represents a unique and disconcerting case. While most of her colleagues were remembered for their brutality, Langer-Feld was the only known SS woman to receive help in escaping from prison from former prisoners. What is extraordinary about her story is not only the escape itself, but the reason behind it, her comparatively more humane treatment of inmates during her service as a supervisor at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. Johanna Langer-Feld was born in Essen in 1900 to a deeply nationalist and Lutheran family. Widowed at 26, she was forced to raise her son alone, serving as a home economics teacher. Although neither a Nazi ideologue nor an anti-Semitic fanatic, she was recruited by the SS in 1937 due to her discipline and organizational skills. She initially ran a reformatory for women classified as social prostitutes, thieves and beggars before being transferred to Thelechtberg camp and later to Ravensbrück, where she rose to the rank of Oberschiff supervisor in 1939. During his time in Ravensbrück and Auschwitz 1942, Langer-Feld maintained a distinctive profile. Unlike figures such as Maria Mandel or Irma Gracer, there are no records of direct cruelty or sadism on her part. Multiple testimonies indicate that she intervened to prevent brutal punishments, protected pregnant prisoners, and refused to participate in selections for the gas chamber. Polish survivor Wozniak testified in 1947. She never raised her voice. She listened when we spoke to her. She prevented us from being taken to the punishment cell more than once. She was not a friend, but she was different. Margareta Buber-Neumann, a German communist political prisoner, recalled, Langer-Feld was authoritarian, but not inhuman. She had a sense of justice that was not common among the SS. She was bothered by the sadism of the other women. These testimonies, while not absolving her of her membership in the concentration camp system, reveal a complex figure who maintained certain ethical boundaries even within the Nazi machinery of repression. Following the German defeat, Langer-Feld was arrested by American forces in December 1945. She spent several months in a prison camp in Bavaria before being extradited to Poland in 1946 to stand trial for her activities at Auschwitz. Polish authorities planned to include her in the massive Auschwitz trials to be held in Krakow. In 1947, she was transferred to a prison in Krakow where she was held in solitary confinement while preliminary charges were prepared, accusing her of overseeing prisoner transports and maintaining contact with camp doctors. However, an unusual development began to unfold. Unlike other guards, a group of former Polish prisoners began sending letters and signing petitions to the prosecutor's office requesting that she not be convicted as a war criminal. Archives from the Polish Institute of National Remembrance reveal that between February and September 1946, at least 5 former prisoners sent letters to prosecutors stating that Langengerfeld did not participate in torture, acted as a mediator between prisoners and the SS administration, and attempted to protect some inmates from medical experiments. One of the signatories, lawyer Zofia Galinska, even proposed that Langengerfeld could testify in defense of other prisoners. On December 22, 1946, the unthinkably bleeping Johanna Langengerfeld disappeared from her cell in Cove Prison. According to a confidential report dated that same day, her escape was facilitated by prison staff, with the active collaboration of at least 2 female administrative staff members, both former inmates of the camp. The document, classified as Operatia Ekran, states the cell was found empty at 6:45 in the morning. The lock showed no signs of being forced. The prisoner's clothes had been neatly folded. The trail vanished in Krakow's Dubniki district, where several houses still stood abandoned after the war. Unlike other fugitives who were quickly captured, Langfeld disappeared without leaving an immediate trace. In 1947, reports from the American military administration in West Germany suggested that a woman resembling her had been seen in Munich, staying with a woman believed to be her sister. Later, in 1960, West German internal security investigations confirmed that Langfeld had been living openly under her real name in Munich's Moosach district since 1957, after spending years hidden in a Bavarian convent. Yet she was never rearrested. Authorities concluded that her alleged assistance to the Polish resistance, along with the absence of solid evidence, did not justify reopening her case. She died a free woman in 1974, at age 73, and was buried quietly. Without public attention, her story remained unknown for decades until Polish historian Artur Miski rediscovered the case in 1999 while examining declassified archives. Among the materials were transcripts of prisoner statements in her favor, reports from the day she vanished, and private correspondence between Polish prosecutors debating the moral complexities of prosecuting her. In 2011, Andrea Riedel, director of the Ravensbrück CAC Memorial, remarked, "The Langfeld case forces us to reconsider the overly simplistic view of women's roles in the camps. She belonged to the system, yes, but she also represented a rare glimmer of humanity within an inhuman environment." During the operation of the Third Reich's concentration camps, most female guards actively participated in structures of repression and extermination. Still, a small number were remembered for behaviors that, compared with their peers, showed a different attitude. These exceptional cases, though rare, appear in court files and survivor testimonies. One frequently cited example is Louis Brunner, who served as chief prisoner overseer at Auschwitz. Unlike many supervisors, several witnesses described her as occasionally shielding certain inmates from severe punishment. Post-war trial records state that Brunner sometimes assigned weaker prisoners to lighter or safer tasks. Although her role placed her firmly within the oppressive system, these isolated actions were interpreted as a degree of relative leniency. After the war, Brunner was arrested and convicted, though contemporary assessments noted that she had been less brutal than many other guards prosecuted at the time. Another figure mentioned is Elizabeth Marshall, head nurse at Ravensbrück CAC. She carried out medical duties within a system that included experimentation and selection for extermination. Yet scattered records describe her quietly helping sick prisoners when possible. Survivor accounts recall that she occasionally intervened to keep particularly frail inmates from being sent to medical selections that ended in death or fatal experiments. Despite these moments of compassion, Marshall was prosecuted after the war and found guilty for her active collaboration in the camp's killing apparatus. Her case illustrates how even a medical role, if intertwined with the regime's policies, was enough to result in conviction. Theris Brandl is another example where subtle behavioral distinctions were noted. Brandl worked as a supervisor at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück CAC, and testimonies during her trial described her as at times displaying less violent,